1,000 books could I write you about her, 'cause I felt if I could know her, I would know all women. Had there not been any too well known for brains and planning and organized thinking, but I'm sure the women are equal and they may be ahead of the men. Yet I wouldn't spread such a rumor around, 'cause one organizes the other, and sometimes the most lost and wasted attract the most balanced and sane, and the wild and the reckless take up with the clocked and the timed, and the mixture is all of us, and we're still mixing. But never, 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 never could have it been done if the women hadn't entered into the deal like she came along to me. Boy, that's hot. Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this is the New Movie Diary, in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. A very strange double feature for this week, and between the two of them, She Came to Me, an ensemble romantic comedy, and When Evil Lurks, an Argentinian horror film that's been generating quite a bit of buzz in the last 2 months, I have to say that it was the former that turned out to be the much stranger experience. I've been trying to do my due diligence this spooky season of seeing at least one horror movie in theaters each week, but I also want to try my best to keep abreast of undercovered, independent, and foreign cinema. Luckily, with When Evil Lurks, I managed to kill 2 birds with 1 stone in that regard, but I hope you won't mind terribly if I open with She Came to Me first, because, in all honesty, and this is the strangest thing, despite the fact that I'm pretty confident about When Evil Lurks being the technically more successful, better made film, I also have to say that there is an extent to which She Came to Me resonated a lot more with me, and I've certainly been thinking about it or feeling about it a lot more. She Came to Me is written and directed by novelist and filmmaker Rebecca Miller. This is her 6th feature film, and just right out of the gate, I'm not particularly familiar with Miller's oeuvre up to this point, so I'm more or less going in blind with this rather complicatedly plotted film that stars Peter Dinklage as Stephen, an opera composer in the midst of a creative crisis following a nervous breakdown he suffered at some point in the past. Stephen is actually now married to his therapist, Patricia, played by Anne Hathaway, between whom they share guardianship of Patricia's 18-year-old son from a previous marriage, Julian, here played by Evan A. Ellison. Julian, in turn, is in a relationship with the 16-year-old Teresa, played by Harlow Jane, a girl of much humbler origins who is herself the only child of her mother, Magdalena, a Polish immigrant and cleaning person, now married to a court reporter named Trey, played by Brian Darcy James. One day after Patricia forces Stephen out of their apartment, encouraging him to find inspiration by breaking away from his isolation and routines, he ducks into a dive bar where he meets Katrina, a tugboat captain played by Marissa Tomei. Katrina is a self-described romance addict with a history of stalking and obsessive behavior. She intrigues Stephen, who accepts her invitation back to her tugboat where she seduces him and they have sex. This experience inspires Stephen to write a new opera about a tugboat-driving Black Widow serial killer, which marks his resurgence as a composer, but also leads to Katrina becoming obsessed with the idea that she has become his muse. But before you go thinking that this is going to turn into some screwball fatal attraction story, it's actually kind of surprising in some ways, in a refreshing way, in some ways in a very frustrating way, the manner in which Miller feels out and finds the story of She Came to Me in a way that seems to very deliberately avoid that more obvious source of dramatic tension. And indeed, the film ends up becoming far more about, on the one hand, the progressive estrangement in Stephen Stephen and Patricia's relationship as the latter begins to have her own existential crisis over the career she has chosen and begins to become increasingly obsessed with rekindling her faith in Catholicism, and then on the other hand, the relationship between the young Julian and Teresa. What happens is that Magdalena discovers Polaroid pictures that Julian and Teresa have taken of each other before and after having sex for the first time, and showing them to Trey prompts Trey to threaten to have Julian charged with statutory rape and effectively imprison Teresa in her own home, a very prickly subject that I wish I could say that Miller approaches in a very organic and subtle way, but in truth, She Came to Me is far from not merely being subtle, also just isn't a very elegantly written film. This is the sort of movie where themes tend to be introduced rather suddenly and to be spelled out in the most didactic way, even to the extent of characters literally outright monologuing about the sorts of background details and character motivations that you kind of wish you felt more from the performances rather than being simply told about. Which is not to say that the performances in this film are bad. I think in terms of an ensemble movie, everyone does about as decent a job as you could ask for, but the problem is also that She Came to Me also isn't a particularly funny movie, even by the more eccentric or quirky standards of an indie romantic comedy. I've seen a lot of critics attempt to identify this as an attempt at screwball comedy, which is honestly news to me because Miller's script and her style of direction really doesn't have the tone or the patter of a farce of that kind, because while the multi-tendrilled plot of She Came to Me is certainly complicated, it's not actually played as ridiculous, and if anything, Miller seems to take the themes of escapist romance a little too seriously for there to be much in the way of a sense of ecstatic comic catharsis, where you really find a spot where you really laugh at something rather than finding that you can, in some sense, get that it's supposed to be humorous, maybe. And I guess that is actually one of the more interesting facets of She Came to Me, which is that for a romantic comedy, what comedy there is fairly deadpan in nature. And if anything, what Miller is doing here is to try to treat the romantic side of things more seriously, and even to the extent that it becomes quite escapist to sort of weirdly try to use this story as a way to explore how we kind of need escapism. That despite the implications of the term, escapism per se doesn't have to just be a fantasy that's divorced totally from reality, that it can be this really important means by which we imagine a better world and a better way of relating to others and a better way of living our own lives. This applies more obviously to Miller's use of age of consent laws in the plot, which I guess I would say are more or less tastefully or at least sensibly addressed more than tactfully interpolated into the ensemble narrative, because I do think that while it's in some sense sensationalistic, I do think there's certain scenarios like the one between the characters of Julian and Teresa where you could reasonably argue that laws intended to protect the potential victims of sexual violence or coercion, or in the case of the Polaroids Julian and Teresa take, laws intended to protect against the sexual exploitation of minors, can be appropriated and misused in a rather oppressive manner like Teresa's stepfather attempts to do, in a way that is obviously in itself highly coded as perverse in nature, as a way for him to use the law to oppress his stepdaughter's sexual autonomy and also to wield it specifically against Julian, who is a person of color, so there's also an element of coded racism in the story. And again, I don't want people getting the ick from the obviously rather remote possible scenario that Miller dramatizes, and the point of her critique is not with age of consent laws per se. There's even a scene in the film where Julian and Teresa are Skyping trying to find out in which states they can get married, and in that sort of deadpan way, the two of them actually end up being really shocked that there are places where you can be 14 and get married. I think the point point is more broadly that She Came to Me as a romantic comedy is exploring how an overly legalistic and clinical view of not just sex, but of love can have really chilling outcomes when it comes to people's ability to not simply live their lives, but to even imagine what their lives could be outside of what is realistic. And that certainly applies to Hathaway's character as well, but it also applies to the sympathetic way that Miller portrays Tomei's character as this person who, again, in the rather inelegant way the film is written, explicitly roots her pathological obsession with romance in the way she was indoctrinated as a young girl by fairy tales and romantic movies themselves, only to discover that, without meaning to hurt anybody, she adopts these very unhealthy patterns of behavior, and where the only solution that a modern society can offer her is to diagnose her as mentally ill and tell her she needs to avoid romance. And again, in a way, it's rather silly, but I do find myself increasingly favorable to how Miller, as a writer and director, however imperfectly, and indeed more than imperfectly, tries to make a romantic movie that's actually about romance conceptually, or that quality of escapism as something that can offer people solutions and a sense of meaning outside the rather flattening, uninspiring paths that are immediately available to them. In some ways, I guess it kind of makes sense that She Came to Me wouldn't be a particularly funny example of a romantic comedy, because honestly, the world that Miller crafts around this ensemble is so thoroughly and understatedly depressing. And to that extent, I did feel that where the narrative was building to in terms of all these character threads coming together in this big escapist climax, I did actually think that it was rather powerful and effective, though if there's anything I really liked about She Came to Me, I should reserve that special power that it has for the original soundtrack by Bryce Dessner, and especially his compositions for the film's 2 opera sequences, which, in addition to their staging and production design, are like so good that I'm not too unsure that a big part of the reason I'm probably giving She Came to Me more of a positive appraisal than it otherwise deserves is because of how those sequences come as such a bizarre, even avant-garde shock to your emotions, and really elevates the entire experience and makes its more inelegant and even kind of inert qualities cohere in a way that clarifies the point of the movie, which is about how we need that shock of romance. We need that escapism. And I think, frankly, is better communicated even in a film that is as flawed as She Came to Me is than a similar, more formulaic idea like that tends to get played out in technically more accessible romantic comedies. She Came to Me might not be a very good movie on its face, but the original soundtrack, including the end credits theme Addicted to Love by none other than Bruce Springsteen, the movie itself might not be very good, but this soundtrack is one of the best of a film this year so far. And I think if you're patient with She Came to Me, it's going to turn out to be a lot more rewarding than I think the critical consensus is letting on. There's parts of this that are certainly, as the kids say, a vibe. I'm giving it a solid 3 out of 5. So before we move along to When Evil Lurks, I did want to take a second to talk about another more seasonally appropriate recent film I saw on video on demand, Dark Harvest. This is an adaptation of the 2006 Norman Partridge novel of the same name, with a screenplay by Michael Gillio and directed by none other than David Slade, whose previous directorial credits include Hard Candy, 30 Days of Night, the third Twilight entry, and most recently the Choose Your Own Adventure Netflix movie Black Mirror Bandersnatch. Taking place in an isolated Midwestern hamlet sometime in the late 50s, Dark Harvest is a fantasy horror concerning a yearly ritual in which the town's teenage boys are inducted into hunting down and killing a lethal supernatural entity called Sawtooth Jack. Every year, Sawtooth Jack attempts to make its way to the church at the center of town by midnight in order to cast a blight on the community's crops, and whosoever manages to slaughter Jack before he can reach reach the church is rewarded by the town's ruling Harvest Guild with a nice house for his family on the affluent west side of town, as well as a flash new car which they can use to leave the town, something that nobody else in the community is allowed to do under any circumstances. Dark Harvest stars Casey Likes as Richie, the little brother of the town's last victorious boy, who, because his family has already previously won, is barred from participating in the hunt, but who, along with his gang of miscreant friends, intends to participate anyway. Emery Crutchfield plays Kelly, a new girl in town who links up with Richie and serves as his romantic interest, and as you might expect, their adventures lead them to uncover very dark secrets that the town fathers are hiding about the true nature of the hunt. But none of those twists come as any particular surprise, because besides the foreshadowing in Dark Harvest being rather blunt and obvious, there's no getting around how indistinguishable it feels from the get-go from any number of bespoke dystopian fantasy stories involving violent yearly rituals and lotteries centered on teenagers that we're all well acquainted with as a template of young adult fiction, except that Dark Harvest attempts to signify its intent for a more mature adult audience, primarily through some really explicit violence and gore, none of which manages to distract from the fact that, with its cardboard characters all fitting comfortably into stock teenage types and its morally simplistic and predictable plot, Gilliam and Slade's adaptation still plays largely like something intended to pander to the most superficial tastes of juvenile audiences, even as it equally panders to the most superficial tastes of ostensibly the sorts of adults who are still narrowly satisfied and more than sufficiently catered to by existing fantasy works intended for actual preteens and teenagers, and yet who might still somehow be excited by the prospect of a film that is both narratively and thematically identical to that corpus of juvenile fiction, just that it has enough hard R violence to signify that no, seriously, this is a mature fantasy work for adults. I imagine that the target audience for Dark Harvest is something like those sorts of nerds who got obsessed with the idea that Susan Collins's The Hunger Games was some kind of neutered ripoff of Battle Royale, because God forbid somebody write action fantasy that makes no secret of its primarily being intended for children and not being drenched in pornographic depictions of teenagers slaughtering one another. But ultimately, I feel like Dark Harvest is something like the apotheosis of a tendency that we can observe more broadly in a lot of areas of the normalization of our thoroughly infantilized media, whether it occurs for comic books, superheroes, or now for young adult fantasies, which is that juvenile media now so dominates the marketplace and is so vacuously consumed by patrons of all ages that we now have these weird examples of young adult fantasy that combines only the most boilerplate aspects of fiction that should be primarily seen as targeted to audiences at a very specific level of mental and emotional development, with reciprocally only the most hollow signifiers of what makes a form of media mature or for adults. I'm not trying to be too hard on Dark Harvest per se. The film is certainly beautifully shot by Slade and cinematographer Larry Smith. The action is more often than not very well choreographed, and the more violent horror set pieces are often strangely alluring in their own right, but there's no getting around the extent to which the tone and affect of Dark Harvest is less like the sort of more eccentric, weirder kind of mature fantasy horror that I think Gilliam and Slade were going for in their adaptation of Partridge's novel, and more like exactly the kinds of assembly line, ghost-authored teenage fantasies that even I think most young people would have no trouble recognizing as cynical cash-ins that just don't do the work of building out credible fantasy worlds or crafting interesting characters where we follow their prosaic experience and not merely their actions. The performances certainly suffer the most in that regard. The cast is uniformly wooden in this film in organic response to an utterly lifeless script, and you can't help but get the sense that for as much work was put into the production and costume design of Dark Harvest in order to give it this heightened dystopian version of 50s Americana mixed with anachronistic punk rock references, whether in the form of a needle drop for the track Neat 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 by The Damned or multiple oblique tired references to the Misfits, you can't help but get the feeling that the actors are merely working with a film that is designed more than it's effectively described, where they're not actually meaningfully engaged with the bespoke trappings of the film's setting as a means of exploring the themes and traumas associated with that period of American history, where they're not really inhabiting these characters and imagining what sort of strange senses of interiority they might have in this setting that is at once so isolated but also so ham-fistedly metonymic of the collective imaginary of America during a specific period. Instead, they just act in the same generic, inflexible way as they would if they were in The Maze Runner or Divergent. The period affects and punk rock anachronisms don't really make a difference in terms of the emotional substance of the story. You could just go ahead and set Dark Harvest in the modern day or in an alternate near future, and it would make absolutely no difference. Tiresome, hollow, obvious, and not nearly as cool as it wants to be, I'm giving Dark Harvest a 2 out of 5. Fortunately, our options for new spooky season releases are not entirely so bleak, as we also have for the limited time in theaters When Evil Lurks, a very bizarre and interesting Argentinian horror film that, at the very least, should prove to be a much worthier and more original fantasy dealing with demonic possession than last week's The Exorcist Believer. This is written and directed by Demian Rugna, who has steadily risen in prominence to being one of the bigger names in Latin American horror cinema. This will be my first introduction to him as a horror auteur, and what an introduction it was, because if you can say nothing else about When Evil Lurks, you can at least say that it is a strikingly original film. Despite the fact that it is a film about demonic possession, it also mashes the scenario with other subgenre elements, including zombie movie, body horror, and post-apocalyptic survival film. Beginning in a remote provincial commune, When Evil Lurks primarily follows two farmers, the brothers Pedro and Jimmy, played by Ezequiel Rodriguez and Demian Salomon. After hearing gunshots one night, Pedro and Jimmy venture out into the woods the next morning and discover the dismembered body of what is known as a cleaner, a professional tasked with cleaning and disposing of so-called rottens, or humans and animals that have become the living hosts of demons attempting to be born into physical bodies. Recovering the cleaner's dossier, Pedro and Jimmy discovered that one of their neighbors, a poor old woman living in a shack with her two sons, has been harboring a rotten, her eldest son Uriel. It turns out that the woman had actually reported the possession of her son to the local police over a year ago, but the government had only now gotten around to actually sending out a cleaner. According to Ruiz, the aggrieved and reckless landlord and mayor of the commune, played by Luis Ziembrowski, this circumstance is reflective of how little the authorities actually care about the countryside. The authorities do next to nothing because they would rather that the locals be scared into selling their land for cheap, he says. Because killing a rotten with a firearm will apparently lead to its possession spreading to other people and animals with whom it's been in physical contact, Ruiz convinces Pedro and Jimmy to simply help him load the bloated Uriel into the back of his pickup and dump somewhere far outside of town. Even after doing this, the rot continues to spread, and fearing the unchecked contagion, Pedro convinces Jimmy to abandon everything and leave with him, fleeing first to the suburbs, where Pedro intends to collect his and Jimmy's mother, as well as his two sons, still currently living with his ex-wife, and then head to the city with seemingly no other plan beyond that. Of course, as implied by the title, evil lurks everywhere, and indeed Pedro's very desperate attempts to escape may be doing more to spread the problem than to contain it. Now, I'm trying to give as little away as possible, but even in that brief synopsis, I do have to say one of the things that is so refreshing about When Evil Lurks is that Rugna actually doesn't really devote much of the film to any clear exposition. As I said, while the film primarily concerns demonic possession, the way in which Rugna imagines demonic possession here is far more similar to a zombie film or to a viral outbreak, and as such, the setting of When Evil Lurks is often quite obscure to the extent that we become aware or begin to infer over the course of the narrative that there is much more going on in terms of the world and history and backstory of the present that the characters are aware of to a certain degree, but we are only ever clued into in bits and pieces. In fact, one of the most interesting things about not only how Rugna goes about the world building of this very anecdotally focused story and how that in turn relates to the psychological dimensions of the film is that despite Pedro and Ruiz's apparent confidence about the danger they are in, it turns out that even going back to the generation of his and Himi's mother, nobody in the story seems to have seen a rotten to even know what it looks like or to know if they've encountered one beyond superstition, despite the fact that there are apparently resources for systematically disposing of the possessed in a way that is a lot more secular and scientifically presented than the Roman rites in The Exorcist. Rottens are almost spoken of as if they are bygone folk stories, where there are even songs that Pedro's mother herself learned as a child and recites to Pedro's younger son in a way that doesn't at all suggest she has any actual fear of the possessed or even believes in them. There doesn't even seem to be much of an agreement about what tends to spawn the Rottens. On the one hand, Pedro's mother will say that Rottens were more a problem of the city, whereas they are also, on the obverse, treated as old-timey folk tales only taken seriously by the most provincial and superstitious rubes. And so even at the level of the basic background of the story, you have this collision of metaphors about the flight from cities to the suburbs, but also modernization and financialization, shrinking traditional autonomy among farmers like Ruiz and Pedro and Himi. And right up until the very climax of the film, where you finally start to think you're getting a handle on how these Rottens work, how demons take possession of people and are born, there is really no consistent clarity over most any aspect of the overall setting and period of the film, such that in addition to all of its fusions of horror subgenres, When Evil Lurks becomes a much more surreal experience than anything else. And on that front, I would say that Rugna is among one of the most successful recent directors in any genre, particularly horror, to evoke surrealism, the nature of dreams and the subconscious, since at least David Cronenberg, because while a lot of supposedly surrealist or psychological horror movies can present heightened or unreal imagery, very few of them seem, as Rugna does, to realize how important it is to not take the stuff of nightmares and render it in a way that is overly cinematic, and indeed to portray it in the more bizarrely naturalistic way that makes these nightmare scenarios, especially the nightmare themes of fleeing from something you can never get away from, or being the only person who believes in the thing you are afraid of, or directly contradictory information that nobody acknowledges, or things and people and objects and animals simply disappearing when you're not looking at them. The way Rugna does it is to take these nightmare themes and make them more disquietingly familiar, because he doesn't overplay his hand. He doesn't go for the most picturesque and slick image. He takes the nightmare and simply renders it in a plain, accessible terminology that actually makes it more unnerving because of that strange mix of the natural and the unnatural, of the familiar and the unfamiliar, of that way of seeing in a nightmare where you don't perceive it as unreal, and that's what makes it so gripping and terrifying. Now, I don't want to overstate things. I don't think that the tact is entirely successful. There is a part of me that feels like, in terms of the implied world that When Evil Lurks builds upon, Rugna might be biting off a little bit more than he can chew here, almost like he's trying to do a Dawn of the Dead type story, but only with a Night of the Living Dead type budget. But even when it's more frustratingly confusing than it is legitimately intriguing, When Evil Lurks keeps you hooked primarily through an assembly of really good performances, and one of the few recent horror films I've seen where I can confidently say that it's almost entirely unpredictable, not only in terms of how bizarre events turn, but in terms of how uncompromisingly gruesome and cruel Rugna's vision of demonic possession, more like a zombie or contagion film, becomes. Be prepared for when Pedro actually makes it to his ex-wife's house. You're really gonna have no preparation for just how shockingly bleak When Evil Lurks gets. This honestly might be one of my favorite horror movies of the year, and definitely top shelf entertainment for the Halloween season. Hopefully it sticks to its limited run for a little longer. It would be a real disappointment if this got pulled before enough people had the opportunity to see it in theaters for the spooky holidays. I'm giving When Evil Lurks a 3.5 out of 5. Very good, very interesting film that really stays with you in the back of your mind and makes you realize how subliminally it was operating in a way that you're not quite aware of immediately upon seeing it. With that, I'm going to wrap up this much shorter than average episode. Like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'll catch you guys next time.